Welcome back, everyone, to day 3 of AAC After Work. This is our third intermission segment, and I'm so happy to say that I get to run this one. You're stuck with me for the whole thing, so apologies in advance. But what I want to do is something that's going to seem a little simple on its surface, but I want to do it in a new way. So I want to come up with a real solid, good definition of argumentative and avocado communication, or alternative and elementary commandos, augmentative and alternative and augmentative, speech generating.
As I sat there, I realized I'm supposed to be the expert, and I don't have a good definition of AAC. I think I need some help.
You know what? I'm going to get some friends, and we're going to get a good definition of AAC.
And so I set out on my mission to try to find experts that could tell me what AAC really is, wearing my trusty adventure cowboy hat. And I almost made it out the door before I realized that I forgot my keys and had to come back. But I decided to start at the local, enormous research hospital, OHSU.
Okay, Dr. Fried-Oken, what is AAC? I need to know.
So it stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, which is a mouthful.
Yeah, so we have SLPs that use AAC with ALS, aided language stimulation. Why so many acronyms?
So let me tell you a funny story about that.
Sure.
That someone once showed me. In 1984, we were at a conference in Denver, Colorado, and on the marquee, it said, "Welcome, Argumentative Communication."
Argumentative, okay.
And I will tell you that anybody who you ask this question, any professional that you ask, what is AAC and why do we need so many acronyms, they will be able to argue with passion
Right.
that this is an important thing. So we started with the field being called non-vocal communication.
Okay.
And then we moved from non-vocal to non-speech communication. But then we decided that speech and vocalizations are in fact means of communication.
Sure.
And what we're doing is we are augmenting those forms of communication with other tools.
Right.
So that's, first we called it augmentative communication, but then there were folks who couldn't do anything else. So
Right.
individuals with end-stage ALS, for example, and for them, we're providing them with an alternative form of communication. So after many professionals got together internationally to come up with a name that met the field, that's how we ended up with augmentative and alternative communication.
Got it.
And it's also because the field is more than SLPs. It's engineers, it's other therapists, so occupational, physical, social work, it's developmental pediatrics, it's educators, it's families. So everybody had to agree on some term that met everybody's needs.
Okay.
So that's how it got to be so many letters and syllables and acronyms that form AAC.
Right.
What I think's happened, however, is because it's we've made it such a specialized field, there are many clinicians or educators who say, I don't do AAC.
Right.
If we had called it communication supports,
Right.
we all do communication supports.
Right.
And it puts it on a natural continuum, because even people who don't have complex communication needs have communication supports.
Sure. I mean, I have augmentative communication in my pocket right now.
Correct. And I'm wearing a form of augmentative communication for when I'm using reading.
Right.
And now with a paradigm shift in what communication is, with Instagram or any other form of picture-based communication and emoticons and symbols besides the alphabet being used, we've changed so much that we're all using communication supports.
Sure.
So at some point we're moving from using the term AAC to trying to understand and use the term communication supports for everyone.
Okay. I like that. We have archaeological evidence from about, I think it was 80,000 years ago, where human foot bones got smaller and weaker right at the same time we started to find shoes in burial sites. But we don't call this alternative and augmentative locomotion, right? So we could maybe strip away the augmentative and the alternative, and really what I'm hearing you say is that AAC intervention is just language intervention.
Well, also speech, also cognition, so any form of interactive, so interaction intervention.
Okay.
We can look at it that way. There are different people who have different philosophies on communication and how we augment. I go by the natural continuum. So when I meet with a family, whether it's someone with acquired neurological disease or it's a 3-year-old who has ASD, I will say that we are all on the same natural continuum.
Right.
It's just a different balance.
Right.
And that balance and how much you're using these tools or these communication supports fits in with everyone's lifestyle.
Right.
So I think we need to do that more and less of, I don't do AAC.
Well, thank you very much. I feel much better.
Okay.
Truth was, I didn't feel that much better. I think she's a little bit too smart. Communication supports, okay. Maybe I'll go get a drink.
So I've been very confused about it. So, Dr. Gibbons?
Chris Gibbons.
Chris Gibbons, okay.
Yes.
How long have you been doing this work?
95, since 95.
95 years. Oh, no,
Since 95, we won't do the math.
Okay.
It's too complicated.
So what is AAC?
AAC, Augmentative or Alternative Communication. It's AAC is any technology, sometimes electronic, most of the time I would say not electronic, that supports communication. Now, so in the world of people who don't have easy access to natural speech, that might take the form of a photograph or a hand drawing or a apple, or it might be a program on a computer that presents them with symbols of some kind that they can use to communicate.
Okay, so a computer can be AAC.
A computer is a device on which software can be loaded that acts as AAC.
But an Apple can also be AAC.
An Apple can be AAC.
And SLPs use AAC.
SLPs use AAC. They eat apples at times. I would hope they do. I mean, they're very, very
An apple a day keeps the SLP away.
Something like that, right? Or maybe it brings them in because then they become even more useful because they can show you how to eat the apple.
I like it. That's very true. So, just as a challenge here for the two of us, what would be a better name? What could we call it other than alternative augmentative communication?
AAC, a different term. How about just, well, it certainly wouldn't be a speech-generating device, would it? So let's just throw that off the table.
SGD is an AAC.
It is an AAC, but that's not better than AAC.
You got it.
It's a slice of AAC. It is an enabling. That's not the right word. It's communication. It's language. It's communication. It's not always language.
I like that. So, like what I do with my phone when I'm texting people.
Yeah, you're right. We don't say, I'm pulling out my device on which I will present orthographic signals that will be, or symbols, that will be transmitted to another individual via a wireless network.
Right. Or ideographic if it's emojis, right?
Or that is exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
It's communication.
AAC is communication. I like that one.
So having asked quite a few people, it seemed like everyone had a slightly different definition of AAC. But one thing that everyone had in common was the idea that all of us are users of augmentative communication in some form, whether that's just texting on our cell phone or typing or whatever it might be. Another way to think about AAC is as a prosthetic, which is probably even a worse term than the one that we use. So I suppose we could call it a communicative prosthetic, or as Dr. Fried-Oken suggested, perhaps even interactive prosthetic. The last time I flew, I took this picture of the bin going through security and realized how much stuff I carry with me that qualifies essentially as prostheses. So, being a past linguist, I'm going to be a nerd here for a minute and talk a little bit about the concept of prosthetics and also the history of augmentative communication. So it's a Greek word. There's many types of prosthetics, right? The ones we normally think of are physical or motor prosthetics, like a artificial arm. We have neurological prosthetics, such as pharmaceuticals, which I'm a user of for high-risk ADHD. We have cognitive prosthetics, which I'll show in a moment, environmental prosthetics in the form of, say, stairs or even just housing in general, social prosthetics, now I think Facebook might qualify, and what else, right? So they're typically conceptualized in terms of the remediation of a disability, but they're actually in widespread use across all populations and cultures. People will say things like animal husbandry to refer to the domestication of cattle and horses and these things, but really what we've done is we've husbanded the entire environment around us. We've made everything more suitable for human life. They're also typically conceptualized as visible, not invisible, in terms of prosthetics. So sometimes there are some that are simply so pervasive or widespread that we don't even think of them as prosthetics, such as glasses or shoes. So I'm lucky in that my quote-unquote disabilities are invisible, which is just colorblindness and high-risk ADHD. So the world's smallest violin plays for my disabilities. I have no need of any physical or motor prosthetics, but I do use cognitive prosthetics to aid with my memory, my navigation, planning, and my attention. One example is my Google Calendar, so here's just a random snapshot. I would power down like a parakeet with a blanket over my cage if I didn't have a calendar constantly telling me where to go and what to do. But also things like medication, Adderall, those things. It took me until my mid-20s until I really faced what my ADHD needed in terms of medication. And while I still am not a huge fan of the idea of medication, particularly not for kids, it has made a big difference in my life. But the comment I made to Dr. Fried-Oken about shoes is very true. So there actually is anatomical evidence, as shown in this paper by Trinkhaus, for the use of human footwear, based principally, as he says, on the marked reduction in the robusticity, what a great word, of the lesser toes in the context of little or no reduction in overall lower limb locomotor robusticity by the time of the middle upper Paleolithic. In other words, our feet got smaller and weaker right around the same time that we started wearing shoes. So this makes me wonder, what else? What other characteristics of ourselves have we exported, at least partially, into our environment? What enables us to live year-round in diverse climates? Why are some areas of the Earth still uninhabited? And then what about cognition, right? So I just brought up some of the cognitive prosthetics. When we think about these habitation pieces, going back to the husbandry, often it's simply a cost-benefit analysis. Like we could build a very warm house on the North Pole, but it would be incredibly expensive. So instead we choose to air condition Phoenix, Arizona, for example. So going back to the linguistics piece, and this is always relevant, I swear, we'll get back to AAC. The very first recorded language that we have was Sumerian in Mesopotamia, which was a culture that existed in what we now call the Fertile Crescent or the Fertile Valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Iraq. The incredibly rich soil there allowed a shift to an agricultural society earlier than anyone else, meaning that they didn't have to be hunter-gatherers anymore. They were able to grow their crops, raise their animals all in situ or in one spot. But it was such a wealthy environment that it actually necessitated the creation of a writing system. So they created cuneiform, coming from the Latin cuneus, which is just a wedge, a stick basically that you'd press into soft mud. And these started out basically as ideograms of pictures of things and gradually became more orthographic, meaning, more like letters like we have today. So we can see head starts out looking a lot like a head, and then over time becomes more abstract. Auroch, which was the type of cow, is very clearly an animal initially, and then again becomes more abstract. But this first written language was an accounting language more than anything. So it was fundamentally binary. You would say something is done or not done, full or empty. It was often for sales of goods, so it was either sold or unsold. Gender only distinguished between animate and inanimate objects, again, for the purpose of accounting. So we would specify that a cow is alive and grass is not. And there were only two verb tenses, one for completed actions and one for incomplete actions. So relative to modern English or many modern written languages, this is really quite simple. But what's fascinating about this is what happened to it. So this other guy, Sargon, who is the emperor of a nearby civilization, saw this evolution of writing and liked it so much that he actually came over and conquered them to take it. So literally, the first war of which we have a record of was fought over a form of augmentative communication, which is, literacy. So how did we keep that info before, right? We had oral histories, things that didn't necessitate so much profound record keeping. And then I find it also interesting about the binary descriptors versus the wide amount of language that we now employ. So a lot of the speakers have been talking about core words and fringe vocabulary and these things. I would say optimistically that the massive proliferation of vocabulary in modern languages it allows us to more specifically identify a descriptive point on a line. So we can say something like forthright instead of very truthful. But the pessimistic version of that is that we've just introduced so much ambiguity into the language that we sometimes can say things without really saying anything at all. We don't really allow for a lot of ambiguity in AAC use, and we very often don't allow a lot of very specific description. So these are all things that we need to consider when we're looking at a robust device of how can we make it mirror typical language, even looking back to the way that typical language has evolved over the last 6,000 years.
So what is AAC? Well, the easy answer is that it's any non-speech form of communication. But we kind of made a long acronym for it. Augmentative and alternative communication. That's the acronym for a term that's honestly a little bit too long for a profession that prides itself on communicating things. The augmentative side would be a tool that enhances the clarity, reach, and/or comprehensibility of our communication. Good examples of that might be sign language, writing, typing, keyboarding, email, text messaging, even emojis. We tend to think about AAC as only being confined into the realm of disability. However, all of us are AAC users every single day. On the other hand, we have the alternative. So an alternative is a tool that serves as a communicative prosthetic to supplant a biological capacity that is absent, has been lost, or is otherwise compromised. Some good examples here are verbal approximations, children that can perhaps get their point across without clear speech, low-tech systems, which we'll talk about in a moment, mid-tech systems, and high-tech AAC. I do want to note, though, that these all interact together. Sign language can be an alternative rather than an augmentative form of communication. In fact, I know many children that use it that way. Writing also can be an alternative form of communication for somebody who does not speak. So it's important to know that while we do separate these two ideas out in principle, there is a great deal of overlap between the two and also a great deal of movement, with perhaps a student who would move from an alternative option up to something augmentative and ideally into a form of typical speech. So a low-tech AAC device can be really easily defined as something that does not use electricity. So this is an example of a PEX strip, picture exchange system, and then a pod board, which is a pragmatically organized form of low-tech AAC. Both of these are still very widely used in classrooms. Mid-tech devices do use electricity, but they're static, meaning that the screens don't change when they're touched, although sometimes they can be replaced with new options. Usually these type of tools will just take a battery or something like that. And now, in the past years, partially as a result of the ubiquity of Android and iOS, we've really moved into a renaissance of high-tech AAC. So these use electricity, they're dynamic in that when you press a button, they can go to another page, just simply within the device. And we also have incorporated other high-tech components, such as the eye gaze tracking bars on the devices on the right. It's important to know that none of these are mutually exclusive and none of them are necessarily the wrong choice. There are plenty of students that will begin at low tech and gradually grow up to high tech. On the flip side, there are students who may still continue to use low tech in places such as I live in the Northwest US, where it's constantly raining outside. So it's good to have an option to take outside that's not going to die in the rain. There's a lot more that we could talk about, like, well, the way that we organize AAC. This is a really good example of what we would call a hierarchical organization system. So that means that when you click on the folders, for example, you could get a new list of words. This is Proloquo to Go, which is one of the most popular systems in the United States and also worldwide. Another option would be a context-based system. So in this situation, you can see that photographs are used to create hotspots on the picture that provoke other vocabulary. And then finally, there's a wide variety of generative options on the market. This one is called Acorn. Some of the same ideas that informed Acorn actually informed the app Free Speech, which I helped to create. So when we talked about the high-tech, the mid-tech, and the low-tech AAC, I said that none of them are necessarily not appropriate for any child. Well, when we just looked at the organizational strategies, so hierarchical, potentially generative, like the last one that we saw, or contextual or picture-based, again, there's not necessarily any perfect right solution. It's your job as a clinician to make sure that you gather the evidence and do the assessments and everything else, and then continue to gather data and follow up to make sure that the decision that you've made is correct, or at least the best fit for that child. The reality is that this is not a very old field, and we have a lot more research and evidence to gather before we are really confident that we're doing everything right. But there's no point in not trying now, because every moment that a child doesn't have a device is time lost. We don't have a lot of time though, so let's get to the real important stuff. What's the point? What is communication and why is it so important? Well, the obvious answers are that, okay, communication is used to convey information, right? To share wants and needs, share opinions, to make requests, to impact the words and actions of others, right? Forms of self-advocacy, making alterations in your environment by using just your language, to interact socially, certainly, and to be empowered, to have the gift of speech or the gift of language. And I think that we all forget as we sit here understanding, I hope, what I'm saying, that we experience one of the highest forms of privilege. I would argue, though, that fundamentally, the purpose of communication is to take an idea out of my head and put it into your head, which, if you think about it, is actually a pretty powerful idea. That means that we can author thought with thought alone. That's amazing. That's the true power of communication. But the power of communication that we see here is predicated by a number of underlying skills that may not come naturally to the students that we serve. One thing that often doesn't come easily to our students is their understanding of symbolic representation, by which I mean using one thing to stand in for another, whether that's as simple as an object or something that's not concrete at all, like love or verbs, things like that, things that are pretty hard to depict with a picture. Well, you probably noticed that most of the devices, and if you have any experience, use symbolic representations almost immediately, including PECs, although some folks prefer to use actual photographs. Well, it may not seem like a big deal, but understanding symbolic relationships is the gateway to literacy for the children that we serve, and ultimately that is my end goal. It may seem a little odd, but let's start our conversation about AAC leading to literacy with a humble dog. So here we see probably the most concrete expression of a dog other than actually physically touching a dog. This is a reasonably good-looking photograph. It might resemble a pet that's at home, for example. This is something that is not that far off in terms of being a symbolic representation from the actual physical creature. Now, where we start a lot of kids is one level up in terms of abstraction. So here we have a symbol of a dog, very similar to what we start out a lot of kids on. To me, it's recognizable as a dog, but there are a number of things that it's lacking, like color and texture and eyes and other things that we would associate with a dog. There are many ideas that inform these symbols, and I don't have time to talk about all of them now, but one powerful idea is that by expressing a dog in this way, the symbol could stand in for all dogs, any genus of dog, which allows quicker understanding of the symbolic representation because we don't have to be so picky about what kind of dogs we're representing. Now,
there's another level of abstraction here. So these are symbols too. They're just very different. Instead of representing the dog with a picture or an outline, now we're representing the sounds that construct the word dog. This is the way that most of us function. We are able to read and we're able to write, and it allows for a great deal more complexity in what we're able to express. I mentioned love a moment ago. Now I can spell the word love. I don't need to find a picture. That's why I say that the ultimate outcome for any child that I work with, in the absence of development of oral speech, is functional literacy, because it opens up a whole new world to them both expressively and receptively, and it's all built on symbolic relationships that they already are learning. Finally, the most abstract form is what we do every day, saying the word dog. At this point, there's no physical representation. What we're doing is basically taking an abstraction of an abstraction of an abstraction and then making it more abstract. I've had both parents and clinicians tell me that they don't think that a kid has any symbolic knowledge at all. Well, there's an easy way to test for that. If the child has any receptive language whatsoever, if they follow directions, for example, or answer to their name, that is symbolic knowledge. They've already got it. They have the seeds. So one of our jobs as clinicians can be to start pretty concrete, but know that they are able to grow. Always presume competence and set literacy as your goal. So that may not have been the introduction that you expected, and frankly, I would have liked to have spent a bit more time talking about all the systems and theories and methodologies and all of that around the different devices and systems. However, that information is out there. In fact, I've recorded some myself that's freely available. And I think it's important to take some time to think about the why of communication, and the why of symbolic representation, and the why we do what we do. There are two key things that I've been building towards that I hope you take away from this lecture. The first one is that intervention with AAC, whether from the perspective of a parent or a teacher or a clinician, is no different from language intervention. Typically developing children aren't born with language. They struggle to gain symbolic knowledge too. There might be a slightly different trajectory or timeline, or there might be a different motor profile or vision impairments that make us have to be strategic about the way we approach instruction. But to approach the question completely differently from how we would with the typically developing child is actually a disservice to the user of AAC, because we have to presume competence and we have to presume that they can follow that developmental trajectory with more support. The second thing I'd like you to take away is that use of an AAC device is no less valid of a modality of communication as oral speech. We all text message, or at least I do. We maybe write letters, we write emails. Those are augmentative and alternative forms of communication for many people. A student using AAC isn't doing anything that you and I aren't doing. In fact, they're doing just about exactly what I would do. They're choosing the most efficient, comprehensible, and convenient modality that they have access to communicate. That's it. And it's our job and our honor as clinicians not only to support them in that, but also to ensure that they always have access to a language system robust enough to allow them to say what it is that they want to say. Well, there's a lot more that I'd like to say, including the importance of core language and how we can make systems as robust as they possibly can be, not to mention ways that we can make them accessible. But as this is a short video, let me just leave you with a few clinical tips that I like to jokingly call Steuber's laws. It's a joke because they're really not my laws. They're things that we know in field, but I have always wanted to have a law named after me, so here we are. Number one. Training of a student's circle of support is the #1 predictor of growth in AAC. We know this from research. It is incredibly important that family and caregivers and teachers and everyone else know how to use the device, know how to model with it, and know how to maintain it. It's actually probably useful to think of AAC as not just the device, but also the circle of support that surrounds the student and helps them to learn how to use it. Number two. A close second predictor is the use of modeling to provide the child with an example of use of the device. As many examples as possible. Modeling is critical. The amount of language that an AAC user is exposed to in AAC form is exponentially less than a typically developing child absorbs from oral language. It's very important that we learn how to model, that we learn the whole device, and that we make sure that everyone around the student can do the same, including potentially peers. Honor every communicative act, even those you know to be false. This is a little controversial, but I've found it to be very true. If a student chooses an orange from their device, but I know they want the candy, I'm going to give them an orange at first. And, they'll clarify, or maybe we'll just have to clarify, but doing things like that reinforces the intentionality and the power of the device. Each device, and this is a big one, is child-owned and child-specific and should not be shared. Decorate it. Don't let it be some iPad like any other or one of those big bulky cases. Put string on it and flowers, paint it. Make it fully theirs. And even if they may not understand what you're saying at first, if you take it away to program it or model, you always ask permission. I don't care if they know what that means. Just start asking because it's important. That's their property. It's their voice. Finally, the only person who can ever truly be an expert about a child is the child themselves. Follow their lead, discover their interests, and make sure that their device reflects what they really want to say. We need to make sure that we're providing the child with the tools to say what they want to say, not just what we want them to say, or else, honestly, we're oppressing them. Finally, no person is defined by their abilities or their disability or any one thing. We are all of us a vast constellation of high points and low points and peaks and valleys and strengths and weaknesses. When you're with a child, embrace the idea that there's more there than what you can see, that they want to say more than they can. This, again, is our duty and our honor.
So, did we end up defining AAC? Not really. We got some great expert opinions. We talked about the history of assistive technology and prosthetics in general. And then we talked about the why of communication and, sort of the point of what we're doing. But none of that really gave me a better name than augmentative and alternative communication, which is too bad. Safe to say that I think Dr. Fried-Oken's suggestion of communicative supports is a great one. And that ties into the comment that I made about how AAC probably should be conceptualized not just as a device or a program or whatever it might be, but rather the whole circle of support that surrounds and enriches someone's ability to use language throughout their life. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful experience doing the AAC After Work program. And stay tuned for Lauren Enders coming up next. We'll see you all in the next 2 days as well.